Sometimes you just stop and wonder about things that don't quite make sense. And it's not just us today with our fancy science and big telescopes. People have been wondering for a long, long time, thousands of years actually. The ancient scribes, the folks who actually wrote things down way back when, they saw some wild stuff. There were things that made them scratch their heads. Things that, even now with all our knowledge, we still can't fully explain. Imagine living in a world without electric lights, without weather apps, without even knowing what a comet really was. Every strange thing in the sky, every rumble in the earth, it had to mean something big. It was a message from the gods, or a sign of doom, or just something completely baffling. And these scribes, from Mesopotamia to China, from Greece to Rome, they wrote it all down. They were like the first journalists, in a way, just recording what they saw, even if they didn't understand it. We're talking about things that glowed in the night, things that fell from the sky that weren't rocks, sounds that came from nowhere. Sometimes these accounts were just quick notes. Other times they were detailed descriptions full of awe or fear. They often mixed up natural observations with their own beliefs, of course. That's just how it was. But when you strip away the superstition, you find kernels of real events. Events that defy simple explanation. Like that time in Rome back in 249 BC when it reportedly rained milk and blood. Or the Chinese records talking about star-like objects that flew across the sky for days, not just streaking across in a second. Or the Greek philosopher Aristotle, pondering why the sky sometimes looked like it was on fire, way before anyone understood the aurora borealis. These weren't isolated incidents. They popped up in different cultures, different times, often with surprisingly similar descriptions. And that's the really interesting part. It makes you think. What if these ancient folks, with their limited tools, actually observed phenomena that our modern science sometimes dismisses or hasn't quite caught up with? What if there's more to the natural world than we've categorized and labeled? We've explained so much. We know about gravity, electromagnetism, plate tectonics. But what about the fringes, the truly odd events? Think about it. These were people living much closer to nature than we do. They noticed every nuance, the way the wind shifted, the color of the sunrise, the patterns of the stars. They relied on these observations for survival, for farming, for navigation. So when they recorded something truly out of the ordinary, it wasn't just a casual remark. It was significant, it broke their understanding of how the world worked, and many of these accounts, they aren't just old wives' tales. They come from official chronicles, from the writings of respected scholars, from religious texts that were carefully preserved. People like Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, he wrote about all sorts of strange happenings in his natural history. He tried to categorize them even when he couldn't explain them. Or the meticulous astronomers in ancient China who kept detailed logs of celestial events for millennia. These were serious observers. So when we look back at these 18 unexplained natural phenomena, it's not about proving aliens or magic. It's about humility, it's about acknowledging that our understanding of the universe, even today, isn't complete. It's about respecting the observations of those who came before us and admitting that some puzzles just haven't been solved yet. And maybe, just maybe, these ancient mysteries hold clues to things we haven't even begun to look for. What if some of these events were very rare occurrences that modern science hasn't had the chance to study properly? What if our perception of what's natural is still too narrow? It's a good question to ask. And it makes you wonder, like, what else is out there, just waiting to be seen, waiting to be recorded, and perhaps waiting to be understood. Number one, can the sky really rain things other than water? Imagine looking up and seeing not just rain, but frogs, or fish, or even rocks. Sounds like something from a fantasy novel, right? The ancient scribes, particularly in Rome and Greece, recorded these very events. And they did so with a kind of baffled certainty. They weren't making things up for entertainment. They were reporting what people claimed to have witnessed. One of the most famous accounts comes from Pliny the Elder, that Roman polymath we talked about. In his massive work, Natural History, he mentions several instances of it raining fish or frogs. He talks about a specific incident, for example, where it rained frogs in Campania, and he notes that these frogs would then appear everywhere, sometimes even dying on the streets. Pliny wasn't just a casual observer, he was a meticulous collector of facts, though he also included a good deal of what we'd now call folklore. But the very inclusion of such events in a serious natural history suggests they were widely reported and considered real, even if perplexing. Another Roman author, Athenaeus, in his Dipnosophistae, recorded a shower of fish that lasted for 3 days in the Chersonesus region. Now, that's a lot of fish, and not just a few stragglers, but enough to be remarkable for days on end. The sheer scale suggests it wasn't just a localized oddity, and it wasn't just Rome. Ancient Greek philosopher and historian Theophrastus, who studied under Aristotle, also mentioned rain of fish. He talked about these phenomena as being observed by people of his time. This means that across different parts of the classical world, people were reporting these specific bizarre meteorological events. So what's the modern take on this? Well, scientists generally explain these events with waterspouts. A waterspout is essentially a tornado that forms over water. It can suck up water along with anything floating in it, fish, frogs, small crustaceans, and carry them high into the air. Then, when the waterspout loses energy or moves over land, it can drop its contents, making it appear to rain these creatures. This explanation makes a lot of sense for localized short-duration events, and it's a solid scientific theory. But here's where it gets a bit murky. Some of the ancient accounts describe these showers as lasting for extended periods, like Athenaeus' 3-day fish rain. Could a single waterspout sustain such a delivery? And some accounts mention specific types of animals, sometimes healthy and alive, sometimes dead. While a waterspout can explain the transport, the sheer volume and duration in some ancient records push the boundaries of this explanation a bit. Also, what about other things falling from the sky? There are ancient accounts of stones, mud, or even blood falling. While meteors can explain falling stones, the blood often refers to red rain, which we now understand can be caused by dust, algae, or even pollen in the atmosphere. But the ancients didn't know that. They saw red water coming down, and it looked like blood. And sometimes the descriptions are just too vague to pin down, like some of the more mythological accounts from various cultures that speak of gifts from the sky or divine wrath manifesting as things falling from above. While those are often symbolic, they might have their roots in actual unusual observations. So, while waterspouts are a good scientific explanation for many cases, it's hard to say it covers every single ancient record. Were some events so large-scale or involved so many creatures that they were beyond what a typical waterspout could achieve? Did the ancients sometimes exaggerate? Sure, probably. But the consistency of these stories across different cultures and centuries makes you think there was something real happening. What if some of these events weren't waterspouts? What if there are other atmospheric phenomena we don't fully understand that can lift and drop objects? What if the duration and scale of some ancient events suggest something far more complex than just a localized weather anomaly? Number 2, what are those strange lights moving in the ancient sky? People have always looked up, and sometimes they saw things that just didn't belong. Not stars, not planets, not comets. We're talking about lights, sometimes moving oddly, sometimes changing shape, recorded by ancient scribes from various civilizations. They weren't always divine or evil. Sometimes they were just weird. The Roman historian Livy, in his Ab Urbe Condita History of Rome, mentions several accounts of shields or lights seen flying across the sky. For instance, in 218 BC, Livy wrote about a spectacle of shining shields being seen in the sky over Praeneste. He wasn't the only one. Other Roman sources like Julius Obsequens, who compiled Prodigy's omens from Livy's work, also noted similar phenomena. In 173 BC, Obsequens recounts a shining light was seen at Lanuvium, and later in 100 BC he records at Caire, a thing like a new sun was seen rising which grew to the size of a shield and vanished. Now, what could these shining shields be? And what about a new sun that changes size? Well, modern explanations often lean towards atmospheric optics. Sundogs, or parhelia, can create bright spots in the sky near the sun, sometimes giving the impression of multiple suns. Lens-shaped clouds, or lenticular clouds, can look very defined and strange, almost like solid objects. But the descriptions often imply movement that isn't typical of these phenomena. A sun dog doesn't usually grow and vanish like that. Chinese historical texts are also full of these sightings. For instance, in the Book of Han, there's an account from 102 BC of a flying shield seen over Chang'an. These aren't just one-off tales. They appear in different annals from different regions over many centuries. The meticulous nature of Chinese astronomical records, which detailed comets, supernovae, and eclipses with incredible accuracy, makes these unusual sightings stand out even more. If they could distinguish a comet from a planet, what were these flying shields? And then there's the Greek world. The philosopher Aristotle, in his Meteorologica, a treatise on weather and celestial phenomena, discusses various atmospheric occurrences. While he mostly focuses on known things like meteors or comets, he also grapples with strange lights. He often attributed them to fiery exhalations from the Earth, rising into the upper atmosphere. But some of his descriptions, even if filtered through his theories, hint at lights that moved or appeared in ways that weren't easily explained by simple fires. It's tempting to think of these as early UFO sightings, but that's a modern interpretation we should avoid. The ancients were just describing what they saw in their own terms. They saw something luminous, something moving in the sky that wasn't a star or a known planet. And they often compared it to familiar objects like shields because of its shape or reflective quality. The key here is the unexplained aspect. If it was a meteor, they often had a word for it. If it was a comet, they tracked it. But these were different. They were transient, often bizarre in their appearance or movement. Some researchers, like Carl Sagan, have suggested that many of these accounts are simply misinterpretations of natural phenomena, or perhaps even early aircraft, though that's a more speculative theory from others. However, the specific details sometimes go beyond simple misidentification. For instance, the idea of a new sun appearing, growing, and then vanishing. While a brilliant meteor could be mistaken for a sun, it wouldn't typically grow in size in the way described. And what about the reported duration of some of these sightings? Not all were instantaneous flashes. Some were observed for a period. So while we have plausible explanations for many atmospheric oddities, what about the truly bizarre movements, the shape changes, or the reported durations of some of these ancient flying lights? Were the scribes simply embellishing, or were they seeing something truly anomalous, something that still eludes our full comprehension of atmospheric physics or even other natural phenomena? Number 3, why did the Earth make such strange noises? Imagine living without constant background noise. No cars, no planes, no buzzing electronics. In ancient times, the world was quieter. So when the Earth itself or the sky made strange, loud noises, people really noticed, and they recorded it. These weren't just the rumbles of thunder or the groans of an earthquake. These were often described as unsettling, unidentifiable sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, for example, describes ominous sounds heard in the sky before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He also mentions clashings of arms heard in the air. Now, Tacitus was a serious historian. While he reported omens, he usually did so within a context of reporting historical events. He wasn't just making things up for dramatic effect. These sounds were significant enough to be included in his historical narrative. And it wasn't just sky noises. The earth itself sometimes groaned or roared. Seneca the Younger, a Roman Stoic philosopher and dramatist, talks about earthquakes in his Nacharles Quaestiones. He recounts deep underground rumblings and roarings before an earthquake in Pompeii in 62 AD. While we now understand these are often seismic precursors, the ancients sometimes described them as something more. They were the sounds of the earth itself expressing distress or power, sometimes without an immediate quake following. Chinese historical records are also rich with accounts of strange sounds. For example, during the Tang Dynasty, chronicles mention sounds like drums and trumpets coming from the sky on multiple occasions. These were recorded by official astronomers and scholars. They weren't dismissed as mere fancy. The meticulous nature of Chinese record-keeping for natural events makes these accounts particularly compelling. What are we talking about here? Well, modern science has a few ideas. For sounds from the sky, possibilities include meteors. A bolide, a very bright meteor, can create a sonic boom as it enters the atmosphere. Sometimes, electrophonic sounds are also reported with meteors, where static electricity generated by the meteor might create sounds in objects on the ground, or even in the observer's head, which are heard before the actual sonic boom. This could explain some of the more ethereal or pre-event sounds. For sounds from the Earth, as Seneca pointed out, they are often related to seismic activity. The movement of tectonic plates, the shifting of rock underground, can create powerful acoustic waves that travel through the earth and air. These can sound like rumbling, roaring, or even banging. The hum phenomenon, a persistent, low-frequency sound heard in certain areas globally, like the Taos hum, is another modern mystery that has no single, agreed-upon explanation. While we can't say the ancients heard the Taos hum, it shows that unexplained persistent sounds are still a thing. But some ancient accounts talk about sounds that seem to defy simple explanation. Like the clashings of arms, mentioned by Tacitus. Was it just thunder misinterpreted? Or some rare atmospheric phenomenon that creates complex acoustic effects? What about sounds that seem to come from empty air without any visible source or subsequent event? For example, ancient Norse sagas and Celtic myths also contain references to noises from the sky that foretold battles or major events. While heavily steeped in folklore, these often originated from initial real observations of strange sounds. The sheer variety of descriptions are from trumpets to roaring to clashing, suggests a range of acoustic phenomena. So, while we have explanations like meteors and seismic activity, the breadth and specific nature of some ancient sound phenomena remain a puzzle. Were these sounds sometimes manifestations of highly unusual weather patterns, or perhaps very rare geological events? Is there some atmospheric or terrestrial acoustic phenomenon we haven't quite pinned down that creates sounds that can be mistaken for voices or instruments? What if these sounds are more complex than simple sonic booms or seismic rumbles? What if they're acoustic phenomena that can occur without a clear, easily identifiable source, even today? And how accurately did the ancients distinguish between real physical sounds and auditory hallucinations, especially when fear or superstition was at play? Number 4, why did so many animals die suddenly all at once? Imagine walking out one morning and seeing hundreds or even thousands of birds falling from the sky, or fish washing ashore dead in massive numbers, or flocks of sheep inexplicably dying in a field. These aren't just modern problems. Ancient scribes also recorded mass animal deaths, often with a sense of dread and mystery. They usually saw these as omens, signs of impending disaster or divine displeasure. Pliny the Elder, again in his Natural History, mentions several accounts of pestilence affecting various animal species, though he often attributed these to natural diseases. But some accounts go beyond mere illness. They describe sudden, widespread deaths without a clear cause that was immediately obvious to observers. For example, ancient Roman records, such as those by Livy and Obsequens, contain reports of unusual animal behavior and deaths preceding major events. They might describe birds falling from the sky, or livestock dying in fields without apparent injury or illness. These were seen as prodigies, clear signs of something wrong in the natural order. While these records are brief, their very inclusion suggests a phenomenon remarkable enough to be noted. Chinese imperial annals, known for their detailed record-keeping, also contain accounts of mass animal mortality. For example, there are records from various dynasties of birds falling dead from the sky like rain, or fish dying in the rivers and piling up on the banks. These accounts are often linked to famines or epidemics, but sometimes the cause is listed as unknown or celestial influence. These scribes were careful. If they knew it was a disease or a specific flood, they usually said so. When they didn't, they recorded the mystery. So, what could cause mass animal deaths? Modern science has a long list of possibilities. Birds' sudden changes in temperature, hailstorms, mid-air collisions, especially during migration, poisoning from environmental toxins, disease, or even disorienting events like fireworks or strong electromagnetic fields, though the latter is more speculative for ancient times. Fish algal blooms, red tides, sudden changes in water temperature or oxygen levels, pollution, volcanic activity releasing gases into water, or even diseases. Land, animals, epidemics, severe weather events, blizzards, floods, poisoning from plants, or even large predators. The thing is, many of these modern explanations assume a certain level of environmental monitoring or scientific understanding that the ancients simply didn't possess. For instance, an algal bloom might simply appear as a sudden, inexplicable death of all fish in a river to an ancient observer. A sudden cold snap might kill a flock of birds, but if the cause wasn't immediately obvious, it would remain a mystery. But what about the accounts where the cause seemed genuinely obscure, even by ancient standards? For instance, some Greek texts mention sudden blights that killed animals where no obvious disease or predator was at work. The feeling was often that something invisible, something unseen, was responsible. Consider also the sheer scale mentioned in some accounts. Not just a few dead animals, but thousands, or even entire populations in a localized area. While large-scale natural disasters can certainly cause this, the unexplained aspect often comes from the lack of an obvious, visible culprit. If a river flooded and drowned animals, they would know. If a forest fire killed them, they would see the fire. But sometimes there was no such visible cause. So, while we can point to various modern explanations, the ancient records often leave us wondering about the specific conditions. Were there certain atmospheric or geophysical events that caused widespread sudden animal deaths that we don't fully understand today? Were there unseen natural poisons or gases released that killed animals in mass without obvious signs? What if some of these events were caused by phenomena we can't easily reproduce or study? What if there were ancient epidemics that left no visible trace of disease? And how much of the ancient fear was justified by truly mysterious natural events rather than just superstition? Number 5, what was that sudden, unexplained mist that rolled in? Fog and mist are common. We see them all the time. But imagine a mist that rolls in with incredible speed, or one that has unusual properties, or one that appears in a place it shouldn't be, without a clear weather pattern to explain it. Ancient scribes recorded such fogs, often associating them with the supernatural, or as a prelude to significant events. They weren't just everyday fogs. In Greek mythology and literature, mists often served as divine interventions, concealing gods or heroes. Think of Homer's Iliad, where gods obscure warriors in thick mists. While these are literary devices, they often stem from real-world observation. The idea of a sudden, impenetrable mist appearing out of nowhere would certainly feel divine or magical to ancient observers. But beyond mythology, there are more grounded accounts. The historian Herodotus, for example, in his Histories, often describes unusual weather patterns, including mists, that affected troop movements or battles. While he doesn't always frame them as unexplained, the emphasis on their suddenness or unusual density suggests they were more than typical atmospheric events. Consider the Roman poet Virgil in his epic Aeneid, where Aeneas is enveloped in a mist by his divine mother, Venus, to pass unseen through Carthage. Again, a literary device, but the power of such a mist to confuse and conceal would have resonated with an ancient audience who had witnessed genuinely disorienting fogs. The mystery deepens when we think about what a mist might have meant to an ancient scribe. It could have been actual fog, but it could also have been a dust storm, a volcanic haze, or even a strange localized cloud. The key is its sudden appearance, its unusual density, or its peculiar effect on people or the environment. Modern science understands fog and mist well. They form when water vapor condenses into tiny droplets suspended in the air, usually when the air cools to its dew point. Radiation fog, advection fog, upslope fog, we have names for them all. We know how and why they form. But what if some ancient accounts describe something more? For instance, some historical accounts might mention a mist that seemed to possess unusual characteristics, like a strange odor or perceived effect on the senses beyond just obscuring vision. Accounts of pestilential mists, or mists that brought ill fortune, could refer to a fog carrying harmful airborne particles, perhaps from a localized natural gas seep or even volcanic outgassing far from a known volcano. For example, ancient sources sometimes mention noxious vapors rising from the earth. While often associated with specific places like Delphi, where the oracle inhaled vapors, what if such releases sometimes manifested as localized, dense mists in other areas, not necessarily linked to seismic activity or vents? Think of natural gas pockets or other geological phenomena that could release gases. If these gases mixed with moisture, they could create a mist that was not only visually odd, but also dangerous. Or consider very localized rapid cooling events that could produce almost instantaneous fog. While less common, certain atmospheric conditions combined with specific terrain could theoretically produce extremely fast-forming fogs that would seem startling to an ancient observer. So, while we have robust explanations for most fogs, the ancient records of unexplained mists suggest there might be more to consider. Were some of these truly peculiar atmospheric conditions that are rare today? Could some have been related to unseen geological releases of gases? And how did the ancients interpret a mist that not only obscured, but also seemed to affect their well-being? What if these mists were actually some form of localized atmospheric aerosol or particulate cloud, not just water vapor? What if ancient accounts of mists with strange properties or effects hint at unknown airborne chemical reactions or geophysical emissions? Number 6. How did deserts and oceans create such convincing illusions? Night mirages are pretty common. You see them on hot roads, making it look like there's water shimmering ahead. But ancient scribes recorded mirages that were far more complex, far more convincing, and often described as supernatural visions. These weren't just simple shimmers. We're talking about entire cities appearing in the sky, or ships sailing upside down. One of the most famous and striking forms of mirage is the Fata Morgana. It's a complex superior mirage that happens when light rays bend through layers of air at different temperatures, creating distorted, magnified, and often stacked images of distant objects. It can make a coastline look like a castle, or a boat look like it's flying. Sailors especially would have seen these, and they would have been utterly mystified. Ancient Egyptian scribes, living in a desert environment where mirages are frequent, likely encountered many such illusions. While direct written accounts of specific complex mirages might be rare in the surviving texts, the pervasive imagery of illusory landscapes and the land of the dead in their mythology could well have been influenced by such phenomena. The idea of seeing things that aren't there, or distorted visions, would have been deeply ingrained. The Greek philosopher Diodorus Siculus, in his Bibliotheca Historica, describes the incredible heat and optical phenomena encountered by Alexander the Great's army in the Gedrosian Desert, modern Pakistan. While he doesn't explicitly name them mirages, the descriptions of the distorted landscape and extreme conditions would have certainly led to such visions. The soldiers would have seen water where there was none, or distant features appearing much closer or taller. But Fata Morgana takes it further. It creates incredible, often fantastical images. Imagine an ancient sailor seeing what looks like a flying island, or a fleet of inverted ships. These would have been terrifying or awe-inspiring. They would have been easily interpreted as divine signs or monstrous apparitions. The Vikings, for instance, sailing in the cold northern seas where Fata Morgana can be common, might have woven these visions into their legends of mythical lands or sea monsters. Modern science explains these with atmospheric conditions, specifically a thermal inversion where a layer of warm air sits above colder air near the surface. This acts like a giant lens, but even with that explanation, the sheer complexity and detail of some Fata Morgana mirages can be astonishing. They aren't just blurry images, they can be incredibly sharp, creating a truly convincing illusion. What makes these ancient accounts particularly unexplained is how real they must have seemed to observers without any knowledge of optics or atmospheric physics. To them, a floating city in the sky was a floating city. A ship sailing upside down was a ship sailing upside down. There was no other explanation, and the sheer consistency of these types of sightings across different maritime and desert cultures suggests a recurring, powerful phenomenon. Some researchers, like Alistair Fraser, a meteorologist and expert on mirages, have extensively studied the physics of Fata Morgana, showing how even a slight variation in temperature gradients can produce wildly different and complex images. But even knowing the physics doesn't diminish the experience of seeing something so utterly convincing and bizarre. The descriptions in ancient texts might be sparse on scientific detail, but they are rich in wonder and fear. These illusions were powerful enough to shape beliefs, influence travel, and become part of cultural narratives. So, while we have the physics of mirages down, what about the psychological impact and the lasting cultural legacy of these truly astonishing illusions? How often did these highly complex Fata Morgana mirages occur in ancient times compared to today? Could some ancient myths of floating islands or sky cities have been directly inspired by particularly vivid and long-lasting Fata Morgana events? Number 7. What were those mysterious lights that danced in the dark? Picture this. You're walking through a swamp or a marsh at night, and you see lights. Not fireflies, not torches, but strange, flickering lights that seem to move on their own, beckoning you deeper into the darkness. These are the will-o'-the-wisps, or ignis fatuus fool's fire, and they've been recorded in folklore and some more factual accounts across many ancient cultures. They were often seen as mischievous spirits, fairies, or even lost souls. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, talks about various forms of luminous phenomena. While he doesn't specifically detail will-o'-the-wisps, as we understand them today, he discusses ignis lambens, or lambent flames, often related to St. Elmo's fire on ship masts, but also more broadly about strange lights. His discussions show an ancient fascination with unexplained light sources. Later Roman and medieval texts sometimes describe lights seen in marshy areas, often attributing them to spirits. The very name ignis fatuus, foolish fire, suggests a deceptive quality, leading travelers astray. These accounts were common enough to become part of the shared knowledge of the natural world, even if that knowledge was laced with superstition. In Celtic and Germanic folklore, these lights are very common. They are called jack-o'-lanterns in some traditions before the carved pumpkins, hinky-punks, or spunkies. While these are clearly folkloric, they are based on real observations of strange lights in specific environments. Monks and chroniclers in medieval Europe might have recorded these as signs or portents. So, what's the modern scientific explanation? The most widely accepted theory for will-o'-the-wisps involves the spontaneous combustion of gases released from decaying organic matter. In swamps and marshes, anaerobic decomposition. Decomposition without oxygen of plant and animal material produces gases like methane CH4 and phosphine PH3 or diphosphane P2H4. Phosphine and diphosphane are highly flammable and spontaneously ignite when they come into contact with oxygen in the air. This ignition then ignites the methane. These flames would be relatively cool, ethereal, and flicker. They would appear to float just above the ground. And because the gas release can be intermittent and the wind can carry the flames, they would appear to move and dance. This explanation, first seriously proposed in the 18th and 19th centuries, fits many of the ancient and folkloric descriptions perfectly. However, there's a subtle debate among scientists. While the phosphine theory is popular, reproducing it reliably in a lab under natural conditions has been difficult. Some researchers argue that the concentration of phosphine required might be too high. Alternative theories suggest that bioluminescent fungi, glowworms, or even piezoelectric effects from geological stress might play a role, though these are less likely for a moving, flickering flame. The unexplained part for ancient scribes was, of course, the total lack of understanding of chemistry. They saw fire without fuel, movement without a source, and it absolutely baffled them. Even today, for some, the specific conditions required for the phosphine-methane ignition are still subject to some scientific debate, especially concerning the exact chemistry and the frequency of such events. Were some ancient accounts also observing St. Elmo's fire, a plasma phenomenon on pointed objects during electrical storms, but attributing it to ground-level phenomena? Or perhaps ball lightning, another rare and still somewhat mysterious atmospheric electrical phenomenon, which could sometimes be mistaken for a dancing light. So, while the phosphine-methane theory is strong, what if some of the ancient will-o'-the-wisps were actually other types of luminous phenomena, perhaps even some rare atmospheric electrical discharges that happen to occur in specific, often marshy environments? Could there be variations in the gas composition or atmospheric conditions that produce different types of fool's fire that we don't fully understand? Number 8, what were those giant pillars of sky dust? You've probably seen dust devils or even larger dust storms. They kick up dirt and make things hazy. But ancient scribes sometimes described pillars of dust that were far more imposing, almost like solid columns reaching into the sky, or massive, dense storms that took on strange, menacing shapes. These weren't just everyday windblown dust. In the ancient Near East, particularly Egypt and Mesopotamia, dust storms were a part of life. But the accounts sometimes talk about storms of such intensity or with such peculiar formations that they were recorded as portents or extraordinary events. The famous story of the pillar of cloud in the biblical Exodus, guiding the Israelites by day, is one such example. While deeply religious, it likely has roots in a spectacular natural phenomenon, a massive, perhaps unusually shaped dust storm or a rare type of cumulonimbus cloud formation. Egyptian hieroglyphs and ancient Near Eastern cuneiform tablets often describe unusual weather phenomena. Records from the New Kingdom of Egypt might mention sand pillars or storms of darkness that were seen as expressions of divine power. These were not just everyday occurrences. The vivid imagery suggests something truly awe-inspiring and terrifying. Modern science understands dust devils, dust storms, haboobs, and sandstorms very well. Dust devils are rotating columns of air that pick up dust, typically smaller and short-lived. Haboobs are massive, wall-like dust storms caused by the downdrafts of collapsing thunderstorms. They can be incredibly tall and wide, engulfing entire cities in darkness. The physics behind them is well understood: strong winds, dry loose soil, and atmospheric instability. They are common in arid regions, so a large haboob could certainly have been interpreted as a pillar of cloud or a storm of darkness by ancient observers, especially if it was particularly dense or unusually shaped. But the unexplained aspect sometimes lies in the descriptions of their structure or behavior. Were some of these pillars more stable or unusually persistent than typical dust devils? Did some ancient accounts describe rotating columns that seemed almost solid, defying simple atmospheric explanation? For example, some desert Bedouin traditions still speak of jinn spirits manifesting as rotating columns of sand, often with a sense of intelligent movement. While clearly folklore, it points to the observed behavior of some dust devils being more complex or long-lasting than others. And what about the sheer scale of some ancient records? A haboob can be truly massive. But were there dust formations that took on shapes or exhibited behaviors that went beyond even the most impressive haboob? Some researchers, like Professor Richard K. Blundell, who has studied atmospheric phenomena in ancient texts, suggests that the pillar of cloud in Exodus could have been a particularly rare and persistent type of dust column, or even a volcanic ash plume. A volcanic ash plume, for example, especially from a distant eruption, can also create a pillar-like structure that rises high into the atmosphere and can be carried by winds for vast distances. While not dust, it would appear as a dark, imposing column from afar. So, while we have good explanations for dust storms and dust devils, what if some of the ancient pillars of sky dust, or storms of darkness, were exceptionally rare forms of atmospheric phenomena, perhaps interacting with specific geological or meteorological conditions that we haven't fully documented? Were some of these truly colossal, persistent structures that would still amaze us today? What if ancient scribes, through their descriptions, are hinting at atmospheric dynamics and dust transportation mechanisms that are not fully captured by our current models? Could there be factors like electrostatic charges or unusual wind shear patterns that create more stable or bizarrely shaped dust columns than commonly observed? Well, number 9. How did such massive walls of water suddenly appear? We know about tsunamis and rogue waves today. They are terrifying forces of nature. But for ancient scribes, these sudden monstrous walls of water appearing without warning were utterly incomprehensible. They were often interpreted as the wrath of sea gods or the end of the world. The Minoan civilization, for instance, on the island of Crete, was profoundly affected by the eruption of the Thera volcano, modern Santorini, around 1600 BC. This eruption caused colossal tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements across the Aegean Sea. While the Minoans did not explicitly record tsunami in surviving texts, archaeological evidence clearly shows widespread destruction consistent with such an event. The subsequent collapse of their civilization could have been influenced by such a cataclysm, and oral traditions, eventually written down, would have spoken of the sea rising up in fury. Professor Marinakos of the Hellenic Center for Marine Research has published extensively on the impact of the Thera tsunami. The Greek historian Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, gives one of the earliest explicit accounts of a tsunami. He describes how an earthquake caused the sea to retire from the land and then to come on again with a great rush and flood a great part of the city of Arobiae in Euboea. He then quite remarkably suggests that without an earthquake, such a thing could not happen. This shows an early, brilliant scientific deduction linking the sea wave to seismic activity. But even with that insight, the scale of such a wave would have been astounding. And it wasn't just tsunamis. Rogue waves, which are exceptionally large and unexpected waves in the open ocean, were a constant terror for ancient sailors. These aren't just big waves in a storm. They are disproportionately large, often appearing out of nowhere, and can be several times the height of the surrounding waves. They can sink ships in an instant. Accounts in ancient maritime texts and sagas might speak of the sea suddenly swallowing a ship or of a sudden insurmountable wave. While often attributed to divine anger, the underlying event was likely a rogue wave. The Bible also contains accounts of mighty floods and destructive waves, most notably the story of Noah's Ark, which speaks of a global flood. While a global flood is scientifically unlikely, the story likely draws on ancient memories of colossal regional floods and tsunamis that would have seemed apocalyptic to those who experienced them. Modern science explains tsunamis as powerful ocean waves caused by large-scale disturbances, most commonly undersea earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or landslides. Rogue waves, on the other hand, are explained by complex interactions of ocean currents, wave interference, and non-linear wave dynamics. Research by institutions like the Norwegian University of Science and Technology has been crucial in understanding the physics behind these monster waves. The unexplained part for ancient scribes was the sheer unpredictability and the immense power of these events. How could the sea suddenly, without any storm, rise up and swallow land? What caused a ship to be engulfed by a single wave when the rest of the sea was relatively calm? Even with our modern understanding, predicting rogue waves is still incredibly difficult. They are rare, fleeting, and can appear in seemingly benign conditions. For ancient mariners, they were truly mysterious and terrifying. So, while we understand the mechanisms, the ancient experience was one of utter helplessness and incomprehension. Were some ancient tsunamis or rogue waves of a magnitude or frequency that we rarely see today, perhaps due to different geological or climatic conditions? Could there be rare localized geophysical phenomena that generate devastating waves that are still poorly understood? What if the ancient accounts, in their dramatic portrayals, contain clues about the characteristics of mega tsunamis or super rogue waves that go beyond our current statistical models? How did ancient coastal communities without warning systems cope with or explain such seemingly random and devastating events? Number 10. Why did the day suddenly turn to night? We know about eclipses. The sun disappears, the moon covers it, and for a few minutes day turns to night. But ancient scribes sometimes recorded instances of sudden, localized darkness that weren't clearly solar eclipses. These were often frightening, unexplained dimmings, or complete blackouts that seemed to come out of nowhere. Thucydides, the Greek historian writing about the Peloponnesian War, mentions a solar eclipse in 431 BC. He knew what it was, but he also mentions other unexplained atmospheric phenomena that affected visibility. For example, he talks about fogs and mists that could darken the sky, but the emphasis on sudden and localized darkness goes beyond typical fog. The plague of darkness in the biblical book of Exodus is a prime example. It describes a darkness that could be felt, lasting for 3 days, thick and oppressive, covering the land of Egypt, but not affecting the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. While a deeply religious narrative, it points to a historical memory of an extraordinary and geographically confined atmospheric obscuration. Modern science offers several explanations for sudden darkness. The most obvious, of course, is a solar eclipse. But ancient astronomers were often quite skilled at predicting and recording eclipses. So if an event was recorded as sudden darkness without explicitly stating it was an eclipse, it might have been something else. Volcanic eruptions are a strong candidate. A massive eruption can spew enormous quantities of ash and dust into the atmosphere, creating a thick, dark cloud that can block out the sun for days, sometimes even weeks, over a wide area. The eruption of Mount Thera Santorini around 1600 BC, for instance, would have caused widespread darkness and climatic cooling across the Mediterranean. This would have been truly terrifying. Similarly, large eruptions like Tambora in 1815, which led to the year without a summer, in 1816 caused global dimming. Massive dust storms haboobs, as we discussed earlier, can also create an incredibly dense wall-like cloud of dust that turns day into night, usually over arid regions. These are relatively localized compared to volcanic ash clouds, but are still impressive. Another possibility is an unusually dense and localized severe thunderstorm, especially a supercell, which can produce an incredibly dark, almost black sky due to the sheer volume of water vapor and atmospheric dynamics. While usually accompanied by heavy rain and lightning, the primary effect might have been the oppressive darkness. But the unexplained aspect comes from the specific details sometimes found in ancient texts. What about accounts that describe darkness that was felt, or had a strange oppressive quality beyond just the absence of light? Could there be other atmospheric phenomena, perhaps involving aerosols or unusual cloud formations, that can create such a profound and localized darkening? For instance, some researchers, like Dr. Colin Humphreys, in his book The Miracles of Exodus, suggest that the plague of darkness could have been caused by a massive dust storm followed by a volcanic ash cloud, possibly from a distant eruption that happened to interact in a unique way over Egypt. The localized nature of Egypt, but not Goshen, is harder to explain by a single large-scale event, suggesting perhaps very specific meteorological dynamics. So, while volcanic ash, dust storms, and eclipses are solid explanations, the nuance in some ancient accounts leaves room for wonder. Were some instances of sudden darkness due to an exceptionally rare combination of atmospheric events? Could there be some form of intense localized atmospheric aerosol or particulate concentration that we don't fully understand? What if the ancient descriptions of darkness that could be felt, or its peculiar localized nature hint at something beyond simple particulate obscuration, perhaps an atmospheric phenomenon affecting more than just light? Were there truly unique weather patterns that could create such profound and sudden dimmings? Is number 11, were those just comets, or something much stranger? Ancient people saw comets as portents, as harbingers of change or disaster. And for good reason, they appeared suddenly, were bright, had long tails, and moved across the sky in ways that were different from stars or planets. But ancient scribes sometimes recorded comet like objects that had extremely unusual characteristics, pushing the boundaries of what we understand as typical cometary behavior. Chinese astronomers in particular were meticulous observers of the sky. Their records, found in works like the Book of Han and other imperial annals, document thousands of celestial events over millennia. They carefully distinguished between Broom stars, comets, Guest stars, novae, supernovae, and meteors. They even charted the orbits and appearances of comets like Halley's Comet for centuries. So, when they described something truly out of the ordinary, it stands out. For example, some Chinese records describe stars with tails that change direction, or stars that moved erratically. A typical comet follows a predictable orbital path. While its appearance changes, its general trajectory is understood. But erratic movement or changing direction suggests something different. Was this a misinterpretation or something else entirely? The Roman writer Livy and later Obsequens recorded numerous prodigies involving celestial bodies. They sometimes described comets of unusual shape or fiery globes that moved. While many of these might have been bright meteors, the descriptions sometimes imply persistence or unusual features not typical of a quick meteor flash. Consider the comet of 1472, observed extensively in Europe and China. While a well-documented comet, some accounts by European chroniclers described it as splitting, or having very unusual tail formations that baffled astronomers of the time, even with their rudimentary tools. The famous German astronomer Regiomontanus made detailed observations, but the strangeness of its appearance still made it a source of awe. Modern science understands comets as icy bodies that release gas and dust as they approach the sun, forming a coma and a tail. Their orbits are well defined, but even today, comets can surprise us. Some comets outgas more violently than expected, or even break apart. The unexplained part in ancient records often comes from these atypical behaviors or descriptions that don't quite fit the standard comet model. For example, could some of the ancient erratically moving or direction-changing comet-like objects have been very large, disintegrating comets where fragments broke off and caused temporary, confusing visual effects? Or perhaps very close passes of smaller objects, perhaps even asteroids, that caused atmospheric effects that were mistaken for tails? Another possibility for some of the more unusual descriptions could be interactions between cometary debris and Earth's upper atmosphere, creating rare luminous phenomena. Or even what are called Earth-grazing fireballs, where a meteoroid enters the atmosphere, brightens significantly, and then exits again, giving the appearance of a persistent, moving, fiery object. Dr. Duncan Steele, a leading researcher on comets and near-Earth objects, has explored the historical records of such events. The fact that ancient scribes, especially the Chinese, were so good at differentiating celestial objects makes these anomalous comet sightings particularly intriguing. They clearly distinguished between a regular comet, a meteor shower, and a nova. So when they recorded something that didn't fit neatly into their categories, it begs for more careful consideration. So, while many ancient comet sightings are explainable, what about the specific accounts of erratic movement, changing direction, or unusual shapes that persist across different cultures? Could some of these descriptions hint at rare celestial phenomena, perhaps even very large pieces of space debris entering and exiting the atmosphere, or highly unusual cometary breakups that are not well understood? What if these unusual observations are not just misinterpretations, but genuine recordings of rare interactions between celestial bodies and Earth's atmosphere, or even unique characteristics of comets themselves that are rarely observed? Number 12. How did the Earth open up and swallow things? Earthquakes are devastating. We know they shake the ground, topple buildings, and cause widespread destruction. But ancient scribes also recorded even more terrifying phenomena associated with quakes, the ground itself opening up, swallowing structures or people, and then sometimes closing again. This idea of the earth swallowing things was particularly frightening and difficult to explain. The Greek historian Thucydides, as we noted before, linked tsunamis to earthquakes. He also describes the immense destruction caused by earthquakes, like the one that leveled the city of Sparta in 464 BC. While he focuses on buildings collapsing, the idea of fissures and chasms opening during a powerful quake would have been very real. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger, in his famous letters describing the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, also recounts the severe earthquakes that preceded and accompanied the eruption. He mentions houses shaking and collapsing and the general terror. While he doesn't explicitly describe people being swallowed, the ground deformation during such intense seismic activity would have been extensive. Perhaps the most famous story of the earth opening up is found in the biblical book of Numbers, where the ground opens to swallow Korah and his followers. While a religious narrative, such stories often draw on real-world observations of catastrophic natural events. The sheer terror of the ground cracking open beneath one's feet would leave an indelible mark. Modern science explains these phenomena through plate tectonics and liquefaction. During a powerful earthquake, the ground can indeed crack open, creating fissures or grabens. These can be deep and wide, and structures built over them can collapse into the chasm. Liquefaction is another critical process. When saturated, loose soil like sand or silt is shaken by an earthquake, it temporarily loses its strength and behaves like a liquid. Buildings can sink into the liquefied soil, and underground objects can float to the surface. It can also cause ground to move laterally. Research into historical seismicity, such as that by geologists like Dr. Susan Huff of the U.S. Geological Survey, often delves into ancient accounts to reconstruct past earthquake events. And these studies confirm that ground rupture and liquefaction are very real and terrifying effects of major earthquakes. The unexplained part for ancient scribes wasn't the shaking itself, but the specific dramatic consequences. The idea of the solid earth becoming fluid, or opening up like a mouth, was deeply disturbing. They didn't have the concepts of liquefaction or plate tectonics. To them, it was the earth itself acting in a monstrous, animate way. And sometimes the descriptions are quite vivid. Accounts from ancient Japan or China sometimes speak of landslides where the earth turned to water, or chasms appearing and then closing quickly, trapping people or houses. These could be exaggerated, but they could also describe particularly dramatic instances of liquefaction or rapid onset landslides triggered by quakes. So while we have robust geological explanations for these phenomena, the ancient experience was one of witnessing the fundamental stability of their world being utterly violated. Were there specific ancient quakes that caused ground deformation or liquefaction on such an extreme scale that it was truly unique? Are there forms of ground instability triggered by seismic activity that we still don't fully understand completely? What if the ancient accounts of the earth swallowing things highlight specific catastrophic liquefaction events or ground ruptures that are rarer today or occurred in different geological contexts? Could some ancient narratives be precise observations of very unusual localized ground dynamics during massive seismic events? Number 13, what was that fire from the mountain that didn't look like normal fire? And volcanic eruptions are spectacular and terrifying. Ancient scribes who lived near volcanoes like those in the Mediterranean knew their destructive power. But some ancient accounts describe volcanic phenomena that seemed particularly strange or unusual, going beyond typical lava flows or ash explosions. Pliny the Younger's letters describing the 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius are the most famous first-hand accounts we have. He describes the enormous ash cloud, the pumice falling, the earthquakes, and the sheer terror. He notes the fire from the mountain, but also the darkness, the unusual lightning, and the strange rumblings. This was a paroxysmal eruption, devastating in every way. However, other ancient accounts hint at different kinds of volcanic activity. For instance, some Greek texts speak of fiery mists, or smokes that burned, or even stones that glowed without being hot near volcanic areas. While these might be metaphorical, they could also describe rare volcanic gas emissions or phreatic steam-driven explosions. Phreatic explosions are particularly interesting. They occur when magma heats groundwater, turning it into steam that then explodes, shattering overlying rock. They can be very sudden and violent, expelling rock, ash, and steam without necessarily involving fresh magma reaching the surface. To an ancient observer, this would be a mountain exploding with fire. Steam plumes might look like smoke fire, but without the classic red lava flow. For example, the island of Thera Santorini, which we mentioned earlier, experienced a colossal eruption around 1600 BC. While largely Plinian ash-rich, there would have been numerous accompanying phenomena, including seismic activity, steam explosions, and the emission of various gases. The Minoans nearby would have witnessed a range of bizarre events from the Fire Mountain. Some modern volcanology, thanks to researchers like Professor Haraldur Sigurdsson, has extensively studied volcanic eruptions and their diverse phenomena. We understand lava flows, pyroclastic flows, lahars, ash plumes, and various gas emissions. We know that volcanoes aren't just about red hot lava, but the unexplained aspect in ancient texts often comes from the descriptions of eruptions that didn't fit the most common visual. What about the accounts of mountains that smoked and glowed for years without ever having a major eruption? This could be fumarolic activity, where gases escape, but the description might imply something more. Or what about fiery mists that were seen around volcanoes? Could this be related to specific gas emissions that react with the atmosphere? Or perhaps even highly localized atmospheric electrical phenomena near a volcano? Volcanic lightning, a phenomenon associated with ash plumes, is a known occurrence. But some ancient accounts might be describing less common electrical effects. Consider also the phenomenon of volcanic lightning within an ash plume. This is a spectacular sight, with lightning bolts flashing through the dark ash cloud. While awe-inspiring to an ancient scribe, this might have been described as fire within the smoke or the mountain throwing lightning, distinct from a regular thunderstorm. Pliny, the Younger, does indeed mention unusual flashes of lightning during the Vesuvius eruption. So, while we know a lot about volcanoes, the nuances in ancient records suggest there might have been observations of highly unusual volcanic phenomena, perhaps rare forms of gas release, phreatic explosions, or atmospheric electrical interactions that left a lasting impression on those who saw them. What if some ancient accounts of fire from the mountain describe phenomena other than typical lava flows or ash, like very specific gaseous reactions or electrical discharges that are not commonly observed or studied today? Could the frequency or intensity of such rare volcanic phenomena have been different in ancient times? Number 14. How did the sun make so many copies of itself? Most of us know what a rainbow is, and we know the sun. But ancient scribes, particularly in regions with cold, clear skies, sometimes recorded phenomena where the sun appeared to multiply or had strange halos and rings around it. These weren't just simple rainbows, these were complex atmospheric optics, often interpreted as divine signs or omens. The Chinese astronomical records are, once again, a treasure trove. They contain meticulous descriptions of multiple suns or bright circles around the sun. For example, the Book of Han and other imperial chronicles describe occurrences of parhelia or sundogs with remarkable precision. They often noted the number of suns and their relative positions. They were seen as important celestial events, often linked to the emperor's mandate. The Roman historian Livy, in his Ab Urbe Condita, also mentions reports of two suns being seen, or suns being seen at night, though the latter might refer to meteors. Julius Obsequens, in his list of prodigies, records numerous instances of multiple suns or rings around the sun, indicating these were widely reported and seen as significant. For instance, in 173 BC, he notes at Qaeda, two suns were seen. Modern science understands these phenomena as atmospheric optics, specifically caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere. Parhelia, or sundogs, are bright spots of light that appear on either side of the sun, usually within a 22-degree halo. They are formed by sunlight refracting through plate-shaped hexagonal ice crystals. The 22-degree halo itself is a common ring of light around the sun or moon, caused by light refracting through randomly oriented hexagonal ice crystals. More complex halos, like the 46-degree halo, circumzenithal arcs, or even periarcs, can create incredibly intricate and beautiful patterns of light. Sometimes, these can appear as multiple suns, or parts of suns, or even pillars of light extending from the sun. Research by physicists like Dr. Robert Greenler, author of Rainbows, Halos, and Glories, has helped demystify these complex phenomena. The unexplained part for ancient scribes was, of course, the lack of understanding of light refraction and ice crystal physics. To them, seeing multiple suns was a direct manipulation of the heavens, a powerful and often frightening sign. It challenged their fundamental understanding of the cosmic order. What makes some ancient accounts particularly intriguing is the specificity of the descriptions. When a Chinese scribe records the exact number of suns and their angular separation, it points to a clear and accurate observation of a complex halo phenomenon. These were not just vague spiritual sightings. And what about the rarity of certain complex halos? While the 22-degree halo and sundogs are relatively common, some of the more intricate displays involving multiple arcs and rings are quite rare. Did the ancients, with their constant sky gazing, observe some particularly spectacular and infrequent halo displays that we might miss today? For example, a full display of halos, arcs, and parhelia can be breathtaking, creating a truly alien-looking sky. To an ancient person, without any scientific explanation, such a display would have been nothing short of miraculous or terrifying. So, while we have the physics of atmospheric optics down, the ancient experience of these phenomena was profoundly different. Were some ancient civilizations, due to their geographical locations or climates, more prone to experiencing exceptionally elaborate and rare halo displays? Could constant ancient observation have recorded instances of highly unusual or prolonged halo complexes that are seldom seen today? What if the ancient accounts of multiple suns or strange rings around celestial bodies highlight specific rare atmospheric conditions or ice crystal formations that create optical effects beyond our routine observations? How did the precision of ancient sky watchers capture nuances of these phenomena that might be lost in our less attentive modern observations? Number 15. Where did that fire come from without any fuel? Fire is essential. But ancient scribes sometimes recorded unexplained fires that seemed to start spontaneously without an obvious ignition source, or fires that appeared from the sky independent of lightning strikes. These were truly baffling and often seen as divine wrath or strange omens. The Roman historian Livy and later obsequens record numerous prodigies involving fire from the sky. Sometimes it's clearly lightning, but other times it's described as fiery globes, or flames appearing in the air, or even fields burning without cause. While some might be meteors, the descriptions often imply a more persistent or ground-level ignition. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, also discusses various types of fires, including strange ignitions. He describes spontaneous combustion, though his understanding of the process was rudimentary. He might talk about certain materials heating up and igniting on their own, reflecting observations that were puzzling at the time. Consider the phenomenon of spontaneous human combustion, a concept that has persisted in folklore and some reports into modern times. While scientifically highly improbable as described, the ancient world likely had similar observations of unidentifiable fires, and the concept of a person suddenly igniting might have arisen from truly unusual, unexplainable ignitions. Modern science explains spontaneous combustion for organic materials. Certain substances, like hay, oily rags, or coal piles, can self-ignite. This happens through a process of slow oxidation. If the heat generated by this slow oxidation can't escape, the temperature inside the material rises. Eventually, it reaches its ignition point, and it bursts into flame. This is a well-understood chemical process. Fire from the sky that isn't lightning can be explained by meteors. A very bright meteor bolide can appear as a fiery object streaking across the sky. If it fragments and lands, it could potentially start a fire, though this is rare. However, the unexplained part in ancient records comes from descriptions where these modern explanations don't quite fit. What about accounts of fires that started in places with no obvious combustible material, or where spontaneous combustion wasn't a likely factor? For example, some ancient Greek and Roman texts might speak of fire appearing on sacred altars without human ignition, often attributed to divine intervention. While these were often staged rituals, the underlying belief in spontaneous divine fire could have been rooted in observations of truly unexplainable ignitions. Or what about the possibility of rare atmospheric electrical phenomena other than typical lightning? A ball lightning, for instance, is a still poorly understood phenomenon described as a spherical luminous object that floats, sometimes silently, and can cause damage or ignite materials. While rare, a ball lightning incident in an ancient setting would be utterly inexplicable and terrifying. Researchers like Professor Martin Uman have extensively studied lightning, but ball lightning remains a mystery. Also, some forms of gas seeps from the earth, particularly methane, could potentially ignite if mixed with the right atmospheric conditions or a small spark, creating the impression of fire from the ground without an obvious cause. So, while we have good scientific explanations for most fires, Ancient records might hint at specific instances of extremely rare atmospheric electrical phenomena, or very unusual spontaneous combustion events that went beyond their comprehension. What if some ancient accounts of fire without fuel point to unusual atmospheric plasma phenomena or unique geological gas releases that could lead to spontaneous ignition under rare conditions? Could the ancient world have experienced a higher frequency of certain rare fire-starting events due to different environmental factors? Number 16, were those just storms, or were they the gods' own whirlwinds? Whirlwinds and tornadoes are powerful, they can lift things, destroy structures, and are incredibly frightening. The ancient scribes, particularly in regions prone to these phenomena, recorded them with awe and terror, often attributing them to divine beings or powerful spirits. They weren't just everyday winds. The biblical book of Ezekiel, for example, opens with a vision of a stormy wind coming out of the north, and a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light around it. This description of a great cloud and whirling fire strongly suggests an observation of a powerful tornado, possibly accompanied by lightning. To Ezekiel, it was the vehicle for divine revelation. Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts also contain references to powerful winds, pillars of wind, and storms that ripped up the earth. While often embedded in mythological accounts, these vivid descriptions likely drew from real experiences with violent dust devils or tornadoes. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his Meteorologica, discusses various atmospheric phenomena including violent winds and typhoons, though his typhoon might refer to a whirlwind or waterspout rather than a modern tropical cyclone. He tried to explain them through the movement of air and exhalations from the earth. His efforts show a scientific attempt to understand these terrifying events. Modern science understands tornadoes as violently rotating columns of air extending from a thunderstorm to the ground. They form under specific atmospheric conditions involving wind shear, atmospheric instability, and moisture. They can be incredibly destructive, with wind speeds that can exceed 300 miles per hour. Waterspouts are tornadoes over water. Dust devils are smaller, less intense versions found in dry areas. The Unexplained part for ancient scribes was the very mechanism. How could the air itself become a solid, destructive column? What caused it to spin with such ferocity? To them, it seemed to possess a will, a powerful, almost living entity. This incomprehension led to interpretations of divine power or malevolent spirits. What makes some ancient accounts particularly intriguing is the sheer destructive power described. While tornadoes are destructive today, ancient structures were often less robust than modern ones. A powerful tornado would have caused devastation on a truly catastrophic scale. Some ancient texts might also describe very unusual characteristics of these whirlwinds. Perhaps tornadoes that were unusually wide or had very strange visual appearances or displayed behavior that was particularly puzzling. For example, some historical accounts might speak of whirlwinds that seemed to chase or select targets, which, while probably anecdotal, reflects the capricious and unpredictable nature of tornadoes. Dr. Alfred Wegener, the geophysicist known for continental drift, also did early research on whirlwinds and waterspouts, observing them in detail. His work highlighted the complex dynamics involved, which would have been completely invisible to ancient observers. So, while we have a solid scientific understanding of tornadoes and whirlwinds, the ancient experience was one of confronting an incomprehensible force that easily wiped out their homes and lives. Or some ancient tornadoes or supercells of an intensity or scale that is now rare, perhaps due to different climatic conditions or larger areas of undisturbed plains. Could ancient descriptions hint at atmospheric phenomena related to tornadoes that are less common today? What if ancient accounts of whirlwinds, particularly those linked to divine presence or strange behavior, are accurate but dramatic portrayals of extreme and rare tornado events that displayed unusual characteristics such as persistent ground contact or peculiar visual effects that are not fully captured by modern meteorological models? Number 17, what caused such sudden, dramatic climate shifts? We talk about climate change today, often over decades or centuries, but ancient scribes sometimes recorded sudden, dramatic climate shifts, inexplicable droughts that lasted for years, or floods of epic proportions that appeared with little warning. These were not just bad seasons, they were profound and often civilization-altering events. The collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt around 2200 BC is often linked by archaeologists and historians, such as Dr. Fekri Hassan, to an extended period of severe drought. Hieroglyphic inscriptions, though, not always explicit about climate change, contain references to famines and low Nile floods, which suggest prolonged periods of aridity. The very structure of the Egyptian state, dependent on the Nile, crumbled under such stress. This wasn't a gradual warming, it was a sudden, devastating lack of water. In Mesopotamia, around the same time the 4.2 kiloyear event, archaeological evidence points to a similar sudden aridification that severely impacted the Akkadian Empire. Cuneiform tablets speak of desperate times, widespread famine, and societal collapse. Scholars like Professor Harvey Weiss from Yale University have conducted extensive research on the climatic shifts that contributed to the Akkadian Empire's downfall. The biblical story of Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams of 7 fat cows followed by 7 lean cows, leading to a 7-year famine in Egypt, strongly reflects the ancient memory of severe multi-year droughts and their devastating impact. While religious, it contains a kernel of historical experience with severe climate variability. Modern science now has multiple tools to reconstruct past climates, ice cores, tree rings, sediment cores, and stalagmites. These paleoclimate records show that past climates were not always stable. There were indeed periods of rapid, abrupt climate change, often lasting decades or even centuries, caused by natural variability or external forcings. For example, changes in solar activity, major volcanic eruptions which can cause temporary cooling, or shifts in ocean currents like El Niño southern oscillation patterns on longer timescales, can all contribute to sudden regional or even global climate shifts. The unexplained part for ancient scribes was the cause. Why did the rain suddenly stop for years? Why did the river that was life itself suddenly dwindle? They had no concept of global atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, or volcanic aerosols affecting climate. To them, it was a mysterious punishment, a profound shift in the natural order without any discernible reason. What makes these ancient accounts particularly compelling is how closely they align with modern paleoclimate data. The timings of some ancient societal collapses precisely match periods of documented abrupt climate change. This suggests that the ancient scribes and oral traditions were accurately recording true, dramatic shifts in their environment. And what about the sheer speed of some of these changes? The 4.2 kiloyear event, for example, seems to have been quite rapid in its onset, making adaptation incredibly difficult for ancient societies. The world they knew could change profoundly within a single generation. So, while we now have the scientific tools to understand paleoclimate, the ancient experience was one of profound bewilderment and existential threat. Were some of these ancient climate shifts driven by highly unusual or extreme natural forcings that are less common today? Could there be mechanisms for rapid regional climate change that we still don't fully appreciate? What if ancient accounts of sudden droughts or floods highlight climate shifts that were not just severe but also exceptionally abrupt, perhaps even more rapid in onset than some modern climate models predict for natural variability? And how did these inexplicable long-term environmental changes fundamentally alter human societies and their understanding of their world? Number 18, what were those glowing things that moved across the sky? Humans have always looked at the stars, and sometimes they saw things up there that weren't stars. Not planets, not comets, not meteors in the usual sense. These were glowing objects, sometimes moving slowly, sometimes erratically, often described as flying shields, fiery chariots, or bright globes. And ancient scribes from various cultures made sure to write them down. We already touched on some Roman accounts like Livy's shining shields over Praenest in 218 BC. And Julius Obsequens recorded many similar events, like a shining light was seen at Lanuvium in 173 BC, and at Caire, a thing like a new sun was seen rising, which grew to the size of a shield and vanished in 100 BC. These weren't just quick flashes, they had shape, luminosity, and sometimes erratic behavior. Ancient Chinese astronomical records, renowned for their detail, also contain fascinating entries. For example, in the Book of Han, there's a description from 102 BC of a flying shield seen over Chang'an. Other accounts mention star-like objects that moved across the sky for days without being identified as known planets or comets. The precise and careful nature of Chinese celestial observations makes these anomalies particularly compelling. And the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in Metrologica, while often explaining things through his theory of exhalations, also describes glowing forms or celestial fires that appear in the atmosphere. Some of his observations, though filtered through his understanding, suggest phenomena that were genuinely puzzling. Now, what could these be? Modern science offers a few possibilities for some of these sightings. Very bright meteors bolides can be spectacular, sometimes appearing to hang in the sky for a moment before streaking across. If they fragment, they can appear as multiple lights. Ball lightning, a rare and still poorly understood atmospheric electrical phenomenon, can appear as a luminous sphere that moves, sometimes silently, sometimes erratically. While it usually occurs near thunderstorms, some reports place it in clear skies. Unusual atmospheric optics, like very complex forms of fata morgana or other mirages, could project images of distant lights or objects onto the sky, making them appear as flying shields. Even St. Elmo's fire on Mass or other high points could be seen as a glowing object if the observers were at a distance. But the unexplained aspect often comes from the combination of features in the ancient descriptions movement that isn't typical of known objects, changes in shape or brightness, and sometimes the sheer duration of the sighting. A bolide is usually brief. Ball lightning is short-lived. A mirage is static in terms of its real-world source. Some researchers, like Dr. Jacques Vallée, have studied historical UFO accounts and noted the striking similarities between modern and ancient sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena. While one should be cautious about attributing ancient sightings to modern concepts, the consistency of the descriptions across millennia is quite remarkable. These are not necessarily alien spaceships, but they are clearly unidentified and aerial. What makes these ancient accounts particularly thought-provoking is the context. These societies didn't have airplanes, satellites, or even basic understanding of atmospheric electricity beyond lightning. So when they saw a slow-moving, glowing object in the night sky, their interpretation might have been spiritual, but their observation of its physical characteristics was often quite detailed. Could some of these accounts describe very rare, high-altitude atmospheric electrical phenomena that are not well understood or studied today? For example, phenomena like sprites or elves, transient, luminous events in the upper atmosphere are now known to occur above thunderstorms, but their full range of appearance and behavior is still being researched. Could some ancient fiery globes be related to these? So, while we have plausible explanations for many atmospheric oddities, the breadth and specific nature of some ancient glowing, moving objects continue to defy simple categorization. Or some of these truly rare and unusual atmospheric or celestial phenomena that are seldom witnessed or understood today. What if the ancient scribes, through their honest accounts, captured observations of natural luminous phenomena that occur at a frequency or scale we no longer commonly encounter or recognize today? And how much of our dismissal of these accounts is due to our own lack of complete understanding of Earth's atmosphere and its complex interactions?